Please welcome our keynote speaker, President and CDO of Common Ground Alliance, Sarah Magruder Lyle.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for inviting me. Was very excited to be here and talk about, how innovation and technology can help us move the needle here. So, been thinking a lot about what's been happening and the damages we see and all the things that are happening, and we have all these great conversations. Let me back up. How many of you are CGA members? How many of you were at the conference? Okay. So how many facility owners do I have in the room? Excavators? Locators? I know I have some locators. Government? Okay. There'll be a little bit for all of you in this. So, one of the things that we really struggle with is the amount of construction that is happening right now. And one of the things that I hear a lot, even when we look at the DIRT report, right, is we do a lot of this. You did it, it's your fault, it's your fault. You did it, they did it. And then that often ends up with, well, we should have done this, or what ought to happen is that. And what I really want to challenge everybody to think about is what is happening, right? Not just the ought part, but the is part. So, for those of you that don't know who CGA is, we've been around for 26 years now, right? We are dedicated to preventing damage to underground infrastructure and those who live and work near it through the shared responsibility of our stakeholders. I've really been pushing to change that to accountability, not just responsibility, but accountability, because everyone has a role to play in the damage prevention process. And so when you think about damage prevention, you have to take your company hat off, your stakeholder hat off, and put on your damage prevention hat. I bet this doesn't surprise most of you in the room. There is an amazing amount of infrastructure investment happening, right? And as the map that was up earlier showed, boy, there's a lot of stuff in the ground, right? There's so much, and it gets increasingly congested, and there's more of it, and we're not mapping it as we go, and we have legacy systems, and we don't know where they are, and that's why this sort of mapping technology is so important, because we can't just keep saying, we have some legacy assets, we don't know what they are. Our water lines have been around for a long time, we don't have good maps. We have to start thinking about how we're going to move forward, because if we keep kicking the mapping can down the road, it's just going to get worse. And spoiler alert, you guys are the first people to see this, because the official report isn't out yet. It's getting worse. We have not been successful in separating out our damage rate to construction, because we keep operating in a world that was set up for a system that had 1 million calls a year, something like that. So when we look at this, the interesting part is, again, this is the new, this is first, right? So the two big ones haven't changed, right? Gas and telecom. But what's interesting, if you look at the telecom damages, that's actually gone up. Telecom damaging telecom. And that's gone up from 26% to 30%, which is actually quite consistent with what I've heard anecdotally. I had multiple communication carriers come up to me at the CGA conference and say, we are hitting each other's lines, we're cutting off our customers, everybody's frustrated, it's not helpful to any of us, what are we going to do? Right? Natural gas still suffering the most from water, municipalities, and fiber installations. So when we think about that, right, when we look at this, and I know I have gas operators. Do I have telecom? Power, water, municipalities. Okay. The only facility owner that's in this pie that has federal oversight is pipelines. And they're held to a different standard. And they get damaged a lot. And the challenge with that is when there's a challenge in ignition, everybody focuses on the gas. But we don't always focus on the why. So I have a few slides here where I want to level set on what's happening. Okay? So when we look at this, and I put it in the APWA colors. So these are transmission lines. These are some of the big incidents, right? These are the ones that have made the news. So the facts here are based on what was reported, right? Except for some on the next slide that have NTSB reports. But look, fiber, water, ag, DOT work. And guess what we keep passing every year in every state law? Ag exemptions, DOT exemptions, right? We keep codifying the same thing over and over that's causing damages. And while transmission lines aren't, struck nearly as often as a distribution line, they can be catastrophic. I mean, the fiber hit in Los Angeles, right outside the airport, not awesome the week before Memorial Day weekend, right? So we have to start thinking about what is happening. Why do we keep letting these things happen? And guess what? Generally, the only facility owner getting fined is gas company, right? Fiber does not suffer the same consequences, or water, or even power to that extent, because they don't have the same regulatory requirements. This is distribution. Now, if you look at this, right, there is no one cause. It's everywhere, right? Construction, DOT work, power work, fiber work. I don't know if this has a pointer on it, but if you look at this, gas is damaged, but it's all the construction happening around it. That's the problem. There's no gas on gas here. So we have to start thinking about what are we doing as an industry to stop this? Well, they ought to know the line is there. They ought to know that it wasn't marked. They should know, but should and ought aren't going to get us someplace. Now, not to leave everybody else out, these are all the other ones. They just don't make the news as much. I'm sure that the one call centers in the room can tell us lots of times where water's been hit and fiber's been hit and all those things. When you get the alert that there's an outage, right, from your carrier, it doesn't say because of a dig-in, right? You just know there's an outage. But if you look at these, look at the amount of work that water, right, is causing a damage. And fiber is causing a damage. So I do want to point out a couple of these. And I'm just going to back up for a minute to this one. So if you look at what's happening here, right, especially the one in Matthew, North Carolina, I have a quote there at the bottom because I just couldn't believe that he said this, which was, crews were digging first by hand and then dug a little bit with a drill. I'm not really sure that's the greatest way to handle the tolerance zone, right? Hayward, California, 40% of their tickets are renewals. 40. Think about that. That paint had not been, there have been no fresh marks since January 2025. Pretty sure that crew wasn't working in that same spot for that long. Right? So that's noise in the system. And what does that mean? That's taking the locator away from a job that actually needs to be marked. By the way, they were supposed to be milling and paving. I'm not sure how you mill and pave and hit a PG&E line. Right? I mean, we really have to start thinking about what we're doing when we pass state laws, when we look at the things, when we look at our policies, and how we're expecting people to operate. Okay, so with this one, I'm standing in the shadow, so I'm going to move over here. How many of you remember the major outage at DFW Dallas Fort Love last year that haven't heard me talk about it? No cheating. I bet you didn't. But you know what happened? An excavator dug in to Frontier Communications mainline and the redundancy. We'll have a discussion about why they were in the same place in a different presentation. Not at the airport, well outside the airport. I think it was about 10 miles, and immediately knocked out computer, phone, and the local radar track-on to Dallas, Love, and DFW with planes in the air. Those are the guys that you hear saying, oh, you're on approach, let me tell you how to get down. Dallas, Love, and DFW are pretty busy airports. 65 planes diverted, 800 flights canceled, 1,200 delayed. And the American Airlines president and CEO, 700 canceled, 1,800 delayed, put out a press release and was furious because nobody from Frontier or L3 Harris, who was supposed to be managing the site, would call him back. 100,000 passengers. Now, for those of you that fly through Dallas, particularly this time of year, there's always a storm. They're lucky it was a clear day. Because when you have 65 planes that are on approach and you go, oh my God, you got to circle by visual, you talk about playing a little bit of Russian roulette, right? That was a catastrophe waiting to happen. We really have to start thinking about this, right? Gas gets a lot of attention, but this one should have. So, well, they ought to know what it is. They ought to know where it is. They ought to know where the lines are. I'm going to challenge everybody here. We have to stop that. We can't keep saying, well, they ought to always contact 811. They ought to wait the required time. They ought to confirm the marks. They ought to dig with care. They ought to complete the project without any incidents. We have to start thinking about what is, right? And we've been having this fundamental conversation about contacting 811 for a long time, right? We've had awareness in use and you're hard-pressed to find an actual professional professional excavator that doesn't know they're supposed to call 811. It's not about knowledge. It's about use. Why are they using it? How is the process breaking down where that isn't a must? Locates aren't always completed. Well, if you're in a state where 40% of the time you're asking for a renewal that isn't useful, you're pulling away already a very restrained resource to go do things that they don't need to do. Marks are not always verified before excavation. Hey, facility owners, if you're not paying for potholing, all roads lead back to the facility owner when it comes to contracts. They hold the contract with the excavator. They hold the contract with the locator. And if you're not paying for potholing and you've got a crew out there, what are they supposed to do? I mean, I've stood in many seasons and say, well, we just paved this. We're not paying for that. Well, what are they supposed to do? Economic pressures, right? Project timelines impact risk. If you're writing contracts based on quantity and not quality, then you get what you pay for, right? And we've seen in states and in companies that actually look more at quality, there's better results. But they're all still operating in the regulatory regime of the state. So when we think about ought and is, where we often end up is why and not how. Why did it happen? Well, you didn't mark it right. You didn't find it. You shouldn't have identified the abandoned line instead of the live line. Why didn't you get out there on time? None of that is helpful. We have got to step back and look at the process and what is causing it to break down. Where did the process fail the people that are operating in it? We have got to quit making it so difficult for excavators and locators to do the right thing. We should be thinking about our industry standards, our company process, in a way that makes the right thing to do the easiest, not the hardest. So this is not intended for you to read every line of this, but if we look at all the failure points in the process, we're certainly not making it easy to get to the right place. We have got to start thinking about how the process is going to make the right thing the easiest. And when we start at the very beginning, and we already have challenges with calling 811 and what the poly looks like, and oh, you may not be marking water, and oh, these people aren't showing up, and they don't do what they're supposed to do. And then, you know what? Here's another one. You're not getting near a pipeline as an excavator if you work for a gas company unless you have an OQ, right? You have to. Fiber doesn't. Water doesn't. Power doesn't. They have some, but not to the level of a gas or oil company. 2 men in a truck and a bore, you're good on fiber. Guess who's hitting the gas line? 2 men in a truck. Because guess what? They're not going to sit around and wait if they're putting in fiber and they have a deadline, because they have to make payroll at the end of the week. And so we have to start thinking about the economic pressures. And look, we talk about safety and we want people to be safe. But when you do the analysis, right, I don't think we're actually looking at how the investment in damage prevention actually pays off long term. Otherwise, we would not have some of the contractual obligations that we have, right? We would not be lowballing the locator. We would we wouldn't be saying, oh, we're not going to pay for potholing. We're not going to reward you for stopping work when you see something that's dangerous. We're going to penalize you because you're a few days late. So we have to really change how we're thinking about that. And I know this is going to make some people very uncomfortable, but when we were at the conference, this is probably the biggest theme I heard, which I was actually quite surprised about. I had not, this is the first time that this has been the topic of conversation that it has, which is we have got to do something about the inconsistencies across the country. So how many of you operate in more than one state? States are like snowflakes, ladies and gentlemen. Not one of them is the same. Not a one of them, right? And so how are we setting up that group, the excavators, the locators, and the facility owners, frankly, who are often excavators, often locators, how are we setting them up for success? I was actually just saying to somebody before we started, I did a PSA for 8/11 Day in the DMV area. I live in Alexandria, Virginia. And I actually couldn't say, wait 2 business days before you start digging. Because Maryland, Virginia, and DC all have a different law. They all have different times. They all have different tolerance zones. They have different activity. I mean, it's crazy. And I'm thinking, how does Utiliquest operate in that? Like, it blows me away. How are we are setting this people in the system up to fail. So standardization, this is the first time I've actually heard people use that word, right? We've danced around consistency, but we have got to start thinking about some baseline standardization across the states, right? And it's an opportunity for the damage prevention industry to self-regulate itself, right? We all get together. We all know how this works, right? There has been some movement in some states about ticket life and large projects. Missouri did adopt a law last year that says you will comply with best practices. Missouri. Some states have bits and pieces of best practices there, but not all of them. So we spend all this time as an industry putting best practices together, yet we're not going into the states and saying, this is what we know is going to help us succeed. Adopt these. We're not doing that. Exemption reform. I don't know how many more transmission lines have to get hit in the middle of a field before somebody finally says, that's probably not a good idea. Anybody remember Dixon, Illinois? It was the year I started at CGA, and I think it was about 3 weeks before Christmas. And new administration, no PHMSA administrator yet. The acting administrator called me and said, there's been a fatal incident in Dixon, Illinois. What is the deal? How could this have happened? Well, the farmer was putting irrigation tile in and thought that their tractor was stuck on a rock. It was stuck, but it was stuck on a Kinder Morgan high-pressure pipeline. And they went and got another tractor to unstick it, and they yanked the pipeline out of the ground and put a crater probably bigger than the size of this room. The farmer killed himself and his son 3 weeks before Christmas, and severely burned several others. What's interesting about that is that farmer had actually called 811 at least 10 times that year. But do you know what he did this time? I know where the pipeline is. I've done this. That's the biggest excuse. I know where it is. I got it. No, there was an anomaly there. It wasn't a straight line. But how many times are we going to see these kinds of incidents in ag and keep exempting it, right? So we keep saying we're not using the is part. We know what the facts are. We know what they say. We know what we have to do. Balanced and effective enforcement. If a gas or oil pipeline is involved in an incident, I promise you somebody will find a way to find them for something. Fiber's not getting penalized. Certainly water and sewer isn't. Power isn't. So when you go back to the slides about all the incidents and the people causing the damages, we're not doing anything to change the behavior. So, well, they ought to be doing it isn't cutting it, right? They ought to be calling, they ought to be waiting. They're not. And so how are we going to change the system to deal with the is, right? Which is really looking at some things we can do now, right? There's so many ways we could rethink this. One that we've been talking about, and I'd like to challenge the group to think about this, and certainly would love some feedback, is we start the process off with the word free. And what does free mean? No value. Now, when 811 was initially started, right, it was a big, advertising movement because we wanted excavators to get used to calling. We're past that, right? We know that they know to call. But we are devaluing the most important step in the process. It's not free. It costs the operators a ton of money to respond to these. So it's no charge to the excavator, but it's really expensive to a lot of people, right? And so if I say to you, hey, Joe, I've got free tickets to this concert tonight. You want to come? Joe's going to say, sure, give me 10. Doesn't matter if I use 4 of them or 6 of them, it's free. If I say, hey, Joe, I got tickets to a concert tonight and they're $100 a piece, he's probably going to go, let me make a couple of phone calls before I commit to that. We're devaluing it from the beginning, right? And that increases the noise in the system, which is what we need to reduce to help with a already very constrained workforce, right? And then we're not pushing quality, right? We're pushing quantity. And the other interesting piece about the free piece, and I've actually had a lot of excavators say this to me, is we've made it almost too easy to call in and renew tickets. Now, these are my excavators saying, I'm not the one calling it in when I'm out in the field. It's somebody in the office, right? And so they go, renew. All of it? Yes. You need paint? Sure, do that too. Easy doesn't equal efficient, right? So there has to be guardrails around it. We want it to be effective and efficient, not just easy. Because if easy is getting us to 40% renewal tickets that aren't being used, that's not really helping us, right? So we have to rethink how we're thinking about this. Software is amazing, right? Web ticket entry is amazing. But we have to remember, well, they ought to know. No, the person in the office doesn't know what's happening out there. And they're not always getting real-time reports. So what ought to happen is not what's happening. What is happening is the easy button. So how do we rethink that to make sure that we're being effective? Not just easy, but effective. I've talked to several people about the PIPES Act, which is actually, I think, being marked up as we speak, or going to be marked up in a couple of hours, finally. But pipelines, again, are the only facility owner out there, the facility operator with a federal oversight, The vast majority of damage prevention laws are at the state level. And I've talked to several of you about some challenges we've had in a few states. But the only way that we're going to have balanced, effective enforcement, which causes behavior change, is to have balanced, effective state laws. And so when we think about that, what does that mean, right? So we have to have some foundational principles about where we are and what we're doing, right? And this is where the ought part is a real challenge, right? They ought to be calling, they ought to know, they ought to wait. They're not. And we still have so many state laws out there that are saying that. They oughta, they oughta, they oughta. They're not. So it's our opportunity, right, to really take the time to think about what's happening in the process and what we need to do to help mitigate it on the regulatory side. So here's the deal. I know there are several gas companies in here, and everybody has an SMS program, right? You're not going to SMS yourself out of this issue because your operational internal program, whatever it is not addressing the external factors that are causing the damages to your pipelines. And we continue to see that disconnect between operationally what's happening and we're not mitigating. Somebody's doing a little house cleaning in the back, I think. But we're not mitigating those risks with law. And so that is a real challenge. And some industries are more organized at the state level than we are. And we've seen, bless you, we've seen some interesting laws get passed over the past few years. And frankly, one of them, I've opposed it. I said it out loud. I've said it in the press. I've said it in letters. Same day bury drop for fiber telecom providers. There shouldn't be anything within 12 inches of our pedestal. There shouldn't be anything where we're going to put our service drop in. If we're hand digging, it should be fine. There's a lot of orange on that other slide. I'm pretty sure it's not okay. It's an ought. There shouldn't be anything within 12 inches. There shouldn't be anything within 16 inches in my field. Well, water, floods, hurricanes, wind, erosion, grading, things that may have been 2 feet in the ground 20 years ago aren't now. We have to quit thinking about ought, and we have to start thinking about what is. And we have to think about the what is across how we're looking at this, right? Because, again, all of you have, QA, QC within your company, right? But we don't have it across the industry. And this is actually one of the places where, technology like what Forum has can help. Because what I know is that we have locators that are working for fiber company A, and they go to gas company Z and say, hey, we were out there. I think your map's off. It's off like by 3 feet. We looked at it. We found it. We tracked it. Here it is. And the company goes, cool, thanks. Not a chance we're using that because you're not under contract with us, and we will be, what's the big word? Liable. Liability. Right? we keep marking the same places over and over and over again, right? And we're not tracking, 4M's tracking the data. But generally, right, we're setting ourselves up to fail. So we have to have a serious rethink about how, and I'm going to go back to, about how we're operating. There's so much potential for us to really work together as an industry and make this better. So I was talking to a couple of excavators earlier, and we all know that downtime, right? When there's a dig in, there's downtime, for sure, right? But guess what? When you get out there and the line's over there and you thought it was over here, guess what your crew gets to do? They get to stop and wait while you figure out what to do because your plans were to go this way and now you can't. You're going to have to go that way. So we think about downtime in generally in the context of a dig-in, but how much downtime do we have when we're trying to figure out how to redo a project on site, which then ends up meaning what? The design and the as-built are dramatically different because you had to do something else. You ought to know where the lines are, but we don't, right? So again, thinking about the is. How do we make sure that that's not happening? And the economic piece of that, I don't think we're always fully calculating. CGA is in the process of doing an economic study. We did one, a while back. Everybody's heard the $30 billion, annual cost of damages. It's dramatically more than that. And we're going to come out with numbers that are actually looking from the beginning to the end, right? But I want to challenge everybody to think about why the is happening, right? We have to make a system that functions on is, not ought. So let's see, how much time am I? So a couple of things. I really appreciate being here, and I really appreciate all of you being here. I think of damage prevention, it's like the gym, right? Part of the issue is just getting there, and especially working to really push innovation and to push technology, right? Mapping, GPS, using locators that are GPS access, using the technology, right? And we don't need an advanced technology. It's all here, right? I come from oil and gas land, and there's always the reports that say we have this much recoverable oil and gas, and then with the next generation of technology, we think we have this much recoverable oil and gas. We don't need that. Technology is here, we just have to adopt it, right? We can find it, we can do it, we can use it. And one of the things is, we hear a lot, it's expensive. It's not as expensive as a dig-in. And I would challenge you, even if you have, a dig-in to water. By the way, not a lot of blue paint out on the street, right? How can major metropolitan areas say, we're not marking our assets? Figure it out. Houston, New Orleans, New York City. Come on, guys. We got to go find our stuff, right? I mean, we just do. And then what are you doing? You're leaving an excavator who's trying to get a job done out there to try to figure it out. And when I was in Texas last year, and I testified, and I'd say probably some of the municipalities weren't super happy with me because they say, well, we have a lot of small municipalities. We can't afford to mark our water. We represent the most vulnerable, members of our communities, yada, yada, yada. And I got up and I said, well, hold on a minute. So you're telling me that you represent the most vulnerable parts of the community, and you're in Texas where you guys are fighting about water with the states around you, and you've been in a drought, but it's okay to leave these little communities without water for maybe a day or two in the middle of the summer, because I'm pretty sure there's not a crew out there that can fix it right away, and you're going to have to get the pipeline. I'm a little confused about that. By the way, water is the only utility we put in our bodies. So I'm just a little confused about how that rationale works, right? Water is like the fundamental. It would be the one that we would want to make sure we protect at all costs. Because even when you get it going again, you've got boil water advisories and your risk contamination and all the other things. So we have to work together to make it better, right? So, and we can find ways to do that, right? But when you could put, pretty large system at risk with something like that. So I just want to challenge everybody that when we're talking about these things to think about is. And there's one other point that I'd like to make. I hear this a lot. Why don't we just have a national one-call law? Anybody else ever deal with the crew in Washington, D.C.? Yeah, probably not a good idea. So I mentioned that the Pipes Act was being marked up. Haven't had one since 2020, right? Haven't updated it. Can you imagine working under that regime? Where they change the rules every time the administration changes, and then, you can't get anything passed, you can't move anything. That's probably not the damage prevention industry that we want. Or a FERC-like regime, right? Where they never have enough commissioners and they don't have a quorum and they can't approve they can't approve the line, and we're in paralysis. Or another one that somebody mentions, well, what about an advisory committee? So I'm on the Gas Pipeline Advisory Committee at the Department of Transportation. We just met for the first time in May in like 4 years. And guess what rule we just talked about? Mary Mac. 2018, ladies and gentlemen, that is not the regime that we want to operate under. We have an opportunity to standardize ourselves and make some consistency across the damage prevention industry on our terms. But if we don't, they're going to be on somebody else's terms. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the incident in Lexington, Missouri last year. By the way, that one really bothered me. That happened the night of my keynote at our conference during our anniversary last year. And for those of you that were there, you may recall me, I got up and said, are we going to be the industry of innovation in technology? Are we going to be reactive or proactive? Are we going to go do the things we need to do, or are we going to wait? And I was having a debate in the bar with a couple of other industry people, and somebody from Missouri One Call handed me their phone and said, there's been an explosion, a home explosion. And about 5 o'clock the next morning, I got a call that a 5-year-old was dead. Now, series of incidents, should have evacuated more houses, but there were a lot of things there. Couldn't find a valve to shut the gas off. There were a variety of things there. And the only outstanding question, frankly, from that NTSB report is, did the line not get marked because it wasn't on the map? Or did it not get marked because the locator missed it? And by the way, that was not a contract locator. So that one really bothered me, because we had just talked about that, about being leaders and being innovators. And so I want to challenge you that when you start thinking about the policies you're going to have or the laws you're going to support, think about that. Are we going to be proactive or reactive? The Attorney General in Missouri gave them the maximum penalty, which wasn't a lot, but also said, and you're going to go find all of your pipelines in Lexington. So we can either do it under somebody else's terms, or we can do it under our terms. And we have the technology to do it if we decide to invest in it. So I'm going to pause. I think I'm a little bit over. I'm sorry. I'm happy to take questions. I'll be here all day, but I really appreciate all of you being here and listening to what I had to say. Thanks so much.